Välkomna till Kungliga Fysiografiska sällskapets möte den 6 oktober 2021, alltså idag. Most welcome to the Royal Physiographic Society meeting on this day, October the 6th, 2021. We will have a main session here today with Professor Keith Horton giving a lecture. But I want you to know that before that we have a short session celebrating new members in the society. The first short part will start immediately and it will take place in Swedish with apologies to Professor Horton. But we will very soon start with English again. Så vi ska nu glädja oss åt ett stort antal nya medlemmar. En annan sak vi ska glädja oss åt är att vi ses IRL den här gången, alltså in real life. Det är inte så väldigt vanligt i dessa tider. Det är första gången på 1,5 år ungefär, om jag minns rätt. Mitt möte senast i verkligheten tror jag var i februari 2020. Sen dess har vi ju kört det på länk och det har ju fungerat, och vi tyckte väl att det har fungerat så pass bra så att vi fortsätter under överskådlig framtid att också köra ut de offentliga delarna av mötena på YouTube även ett tag framöver. Vi tror att det kan vara en fördel för både sällskapet och för många som inte kan komma fysiskt. Då börjar vi med utdelningen av diplom till nyvalda medlemmar.
Ja, då ropar jag upp i tur och ordning och ber er komma fram att mottaga ledamotsdiplom och ledamotsnål. Och jag börjar med Leif Andersson.
Varsågod. Välkommen i sällskapet.
Andreas Berg.
Andreas Berg.
Absens. Agneta Gultz.
Ja, då får vi ta honom och efteråt. Välkommen i sällskapet.
Då gör vi hack tillbaka. Andreas Berg.
Där miste du nästan medlemskapet igen. Men välkommen i sällskapet. Det är ingen så. Du tappade nålen, Andreas. Du bugade för djupt.
Åsa Hansson.
Välkommen i sällskapet.
Johan Helsing.
Välkommen till sällskapet. Tack.
Rickard Ignell.
Välkommen i sällskapet.
Emma Kritsberg.
Och välkommen jättemycket.
Nils Ryde.
Välkommen i sällskapet.
Oksana Smirnova.
välkommen i sällskapet också.
Johan Stenström.
Välkommen i sällskapet.
Fredrik Tuvesson.
Välkommen i sällskapet.
Per Tunestål.
Och välkommen i sällskapet, Per. Tack. Återigen välkomna till alla. Det finns några ytterligare som inte kunde vara med och det finns en del utländska nya ledamöter också. Men vi läste bara upp de som är här. De andra kan man säkert hitta på vår hemsida. Then I think we should proceed in English because we are now very close to starting with our lecture this evening. The lecture is given to the honor is given to Professor Keith Horton, but I will not introduce him. Our first Vice President, Lill Träskman-Bentz, Professor in Psychiatry, will give the introduction. So with this, I give the floor to Lill, and please go ahead. And again, welcome, Professor Horton.
Thank you. Yeah, good evening. Sven Berggren, he was an MD, PhD, who died from a drowning accident in the late 1940s. And his parents later honored him by founding the Sven Berggren Prize. The Sven Berggren Prize winner of this year is Professor Keith Horton, Oxford University. Keith Horton is Professor of Psychiatry and a consultant psychiatrist. He is the director of the Center for Suicide Research at Oxford University. He and his research group have been conducting investigations concerning causes, treatment, prevention and outcome of suicidal behavior for more than 40 years. And this research has resulted in many hundreds of publications and also many books. Professor Horton has also received many awards. And in the 2020 Queen's Birthday Honours list, he was made a Commander of the British Empire for services to suicide prevention. So, Professor Horton's presentation of this evening is Suicide Prevention, Does It Work? So, please, Professor Keith Horton.
Well, thank you very much for that kind invitation. It's a great honor to receive this prestigious award from the Royal Physiographic Society, and I wish to thank the Society for honoring me in this way. I'm extremely sorry I can't be in Lund in person. I have visited the city several times in the past, which I've greatly enjoyed, and I would love to have come back for this occasion, but hopefully it will be possible for me to visit Lund again at some stage in the near future. So as Professor Träskman-Bentz said, the topic for my presentation is suicide prevention, does it work? Why have I chosen this topic? One of the reasons is that suicide is a major problem globally. It's been estimated by the World Health Organization recently that there are over 700,000 suicides per year. Suicide is more common in men than women generally. In England, we have about approximately 5,250 deaths which are attributed to suicide. In Sweden, the figure is approximately 1,200. The size of the global problem that I've given you is probably a lot larger than that figure of over 700,000, because many suicides go unrecognized as such. But even with that figure, this amounts to more deaths than from AIDS per year or warfare. In the UK, it's the most common cause of death under 45 years of age. And globally, it's the second most common cause of death in under 25-year-olds. And it's a particularly common cause of death in females in lower and middle income countries, such as India and Sri Lanka. Now, as a result of this recognition of the problem of suicide, the World Health Organization in 1996 encouraged countries to develop national suicide prevention strategies. In 2002, we developed a strategy for England, a national strategy, and in Sweden, a national strategy was developed in 2008. Our strategy was revised very considerably in 2012. This is our strategy, not a very impressive cover, I'm afraid, but I'll just summarize the content of it. It consists of a number of areas for action. The first one is to reduce the risk of suicide in key high-risk groups. So this would be, for example, people with mental health problems, prisoners, which are another high-risk group. The second area is to tailor approaches to improving mental health in specific groups on the basis that this would reduce suicide. So this would include children, adolescents, and also older people, for example. And then there's an area focused on reducing access to the means for suicide, which I'll say about later. And then self-harm, which is equivalent to attempted suicide, but goes beyond that, and I'll again explain that later, was introduced as a key indicator of suicide risk in 2017, added to the strategy. And then there's an area focused on providing better information and support to people bereaved or affected by suicide. There's an area focused on the media concerning and trying to improve media reporting of suicide. And lastly, and thankfully, there's also an emphasis on supporting research, data collection, and monitoring. This is the Swedish strategy introduced in 2008. I'm not going to say anything specifically about the content. Some of it overlaps very much with our strategy, but there are some additional components. Now, in thinking about prevention, one thing one has to consider is that suicide can result from many factors, including genetic factors. I mean, we know that suicide can run in families, for example, and obviously psychiatric disorder is a very important contributor to suicide. Traumatic experiences can be important both in early childhood and later in life. And we know that suicide is associated with social deprivation and economic problems. Exposure to suicidal behavior of other people and via the media can be a contributor, and as can access to means for suicide. So effective suicide prevention must include a wide range of initiatives. There are problems in trying to evaluate suicide prevention. The numbers of suicides, while I've presented large global numbers to you, if you're looking at a particular area over a particular period of time, the numbers may be relatively small. And this makes evaluation difficult. And so one may have to focus on other measures related to suicide, such as self-harm or suicide attempts. Trials of intervention are difficult. So it's very difficult to do trials in the way one might, for example, do a drug trial. And there tends to be reliance mainly on naturalistic evaluations. That is where you look at the numbers of suicides before an intervention and after. But the problem with this is that other things can happen, particularly socioeconomic events, and how governments respond to these, which may have powerful influences on suicide. And here's an example. The 2008-9 economic recession resulted in major increases in suicide and self-harm in many countries, particularly in men. One other aspect of evaluation of effectiveness is that there tends to be a lot of focus on what are called high-risk group strategies, where one takes a particular group and tries to do an intervention in that group. But interestingly, population strategies, in other words, where you try to change risk in the whole population in some way, tend to be much more powerful and effective. So this would include, for example, changing access to means for suicide, which could have an relevance to the whole population. So what I'm going to cover, that was by way of introduction. What I will cover is people with mental health problems, self-harm, restricting access to suicide methods, media reporting and portrayal of suicide, and I'll finish saying a few words about people bereaved by suicide. So people with mental health problems, these are obviously extremely important in terms of suicide prevention. We know from several studies that the vast majority of people who die by suicide have at least one psychiatric disorder or reach criteria for disorder. Sometimes this won't have been recognized while they were alive, but in retrospect, it becomes apparent. And this includes particularly depression, anxiety, bipolar disorder, psychosis or schizophrenia, alcohol misuse, and in women, eating disorders. And in the UK, we know that approaching 30% of people who die by suicide have been in contact with a mental health service at the time of their deaths or in the year beforehand. So one question is, how effective are psychiatric services? Now, back 20 years ago, our National Confidential Inquiry, which is based in Manchester, came up with a list of recommended changes or improvements to services for preventing suicide. First was making inpatient units safer. Secondly, assertive outreach. This is following up people in the community who haven't attended appointments. 24-hour teams available to deal with people with crisis in the community to provide them with help. Early follow-up after discharge from psychiatric hospital inpatient care. Policies for helping people who are not adhering to treatment recommendations. Services for people with dual diagnosis. This would be, for example, someone having both depression and alcohol misuse, which may necessitate complex interventions. And where people are involved with the criminal justice system, then sharing information between psychiatry and the criminal justice system. Where deaths occur, where they sadly occur, then having multidisciplinary review of these events to see if one can find the contributory factors, and finally, training in suicide risk management. So one question was, did mental health services implement these policies? And if they did it make a difference? Now, this slide shows the results of a study reported in The Lancet in 2012, where the authors looked at the change in suicide rates in services, first of all in green, which implemented few of the recommendations that I showed you earlier, and in blue, services which implemented more of these recommendations. And you can see as time went on, differences started to appear. And by 2005, 2006, there was a significant difference in the suicide rate with a lower rate in services which implemented these recommendations. So this is evidence that, I mean, it's not definitive, but it strongly suggests that where services improve what they're providing, then this can lead to a reduction in suicides. Now, I'd like to consider a specific treatment. First of all, antidepressants. And this is an obvious treatment to consider because of the high prevalence of depression in people who die by suicide. So a big question has been, do antidepressants reduce risk of suicide in people with depression? And this would seem like a very simple question. In fact, it's one that's challenged a lot of people. There's been much debate, much controversy. And on this slide, I've just simply summarized what seems to be the current conclusions. Firstly, that in children and adolescents, antidepressants, particularly the newer ones, may increase risk of suicidal behavior. They certainly are known to increase thoughts of suicide, and therefore there have been concerns about the extent to which they might be used in children and adolescents. In adults, there have been several studies of effectiveness of antidepressants in relation to suicidal behavior, but the evidence is still uncertain, which seems very surprising. However, in older people, several studies have now shown that these do in fact reduce risk of suicide. So what might seem a simple question, I'm afraid has a rather complex and somewhat confusing answer. I'd like to say a bit about another specific drug, lithium or lithium carbonate. This is a drug that's used quite a lot for prevention of relapse in people with bipolar disorder who may experience periods of mania or depression. We've taken quite an interest in how effective it might be in relation to possible prevention of suicide. A few years ago, we put together a number of studies that have been done comparing lithium treatment with placebo. And the analysis of these data showed quite clearly that there were fewer suicides in people on treatment with lithium than with placebo. And importantly, it also showed there were fewer deaths overall. This is important because we know that lithium can have adverse effects on thyroid and renal function. And then there was an elegant study, and this was using Swedish national registry data. And we're terribly envious in the UK of the wonderful registers that you have in Scandinavia, which allow investigations like this. And in this investigation, Song and colleagues compared suicidal behavior during lithium treatment with valproate or sodium valproate, which is another commonly used mood stabilizer. And what they showed was that suicidal events, they combined suicides and suicide attempts, were significantly decreased during treatment with lithium, but not during treatment with valproate. And they estimated that 12% of suicidal events could have been prevented if all patients had taken lithium during the entire follow-up study. Now, we've been involved with a similar study with colleagues in Copenhagen working on Danish national case registers. This study hasn't yet been published. It's under review, so I can only just summarize the results. But what we found is that treatment with lithium was associated with fewer suicides than other drug treatments, including valproate, which I've already mentioned, but also other mood stabilizers and antipsychotics. and fewer patients on lithium engaged in self-harm, and fewer required hospital admission. So there's pretty good evidence that lithium is of particular benefit in people with bipolar disorder and can reduce risk of suicide. And yet, paradoxically, lithium has been used, the use of lithium has decreased quite a bit in several countries, in the USA in particular. Why might that be? Well, lithium is not a proprietary drug now. It's not under patent. So there's little commercial interest in it, and it doesn't get promoted like other drugs do. And this is really a sad fact when it could be saving lives. So I'd now like to turn to talking about self-harm. What do we mean by the self-harm? This is our definition: intentional, non-fatal self-poisoning or self-injury, irrespective of whether it's a suicide attempt, whether it's suicidal intent, or whether there's some other sort of motive, such as someone blotting out a bad state of mind, or getting relief from tension. Why is it important? In the UK, we've estimated that there are approximately 200,000 hospital presentations per year for self-harm. It's commonly repeated, and it's a key risk factor for subsequent suicide. In a recent investigation, we showed that the risk in the year after presentation to hospital for self-harm was 50 times the risk of suicide in the general population. And it's particularly a risk when self-harm is repeated. Now, in the UK, we've got national guidelines. I don't know whether there are similar ones in Sweden. There may well be, but we had a first guideline produced in 2004, and then another one in 2012, and a further one is going to be published early next year. And key elements in these guides are that there should be services for self-harm patients in all general hospitals, and that's pretty well the case now, certainly in the UK. And then that all patients presenting with self-harm should receive a psychosocial assessment by a mental health professional of their needs, risk, and so on. And thirdly, that psychological therapy, as it can be effective, it is recommended for treatment of patients. In terms of psychosocial assessment, our group did a study a few years ago involving our multi-center study of self-harm in England, where we collect data on self-harm presentations in Oxford, Manchester, and Derby. And this showed that assessment was associated with reduced repetition of self-harm in the following year, at least in two out of the three centers. Interestingly, in the third center, the far fewer patients actually received a psychosocial assessment. And then in terms of psychological therapy being effective, we've been involved for many years now in what's called a Cochrane review, where one assembles all the evidence from treatment trials about various interventions. And in this case, we're looking at psychological interventions for self-harm patients. And in summary, what we've shown is that psychotherapy, which incorporates elements of cognitive behavior therapy, is more effective than treatment as usual. In other words, what people might have got usually in their treatment setting. And indeed, in our update of our review based on 12 trials, we found that therapy was associated with a 48% reduction in repetition of self-harm 6 months after the end of therapy, compared with treatment as usual. So we don't know whether this translates into prevention of suicide. One would need enormous trials, almost impossible to do, to examine that. But on the basis that repetition of self-harm increases risk, we would suggest that this could be a useful intervention in that respect. I'd now like to turn to restriction of access to suicide methods. And this is important for obvious reasons. This slide shows a number of factors that may contribute to risk of suicide. I'm not going to dwell on those, but I'd just like to focus on availability of method. And quite simply, it is well demonstrated that if methods commonly available, easily available, are more dangerous, then outcome of any self-harm act is more likely to be death, suicide, whereas lower availability or availability of less dangerous methods are more likely to result in acts being non-fatal. That's very rather simple notion. So what is the evidence on this? Well, there is quite a lot. I'm going to mention some examples. The first one is that of reducing pack sizes of paracetamol. Paracetamol, as you'll know, is a mild painkiller. And in the UK in 1998, September 1998, we had legislation to reduce pack sizes of paracetamol from 100 to 32 maximum number of tablets in pharmacies, and from 24 to 16 in other outlets, which would include, for example, supermarkets, garages, and so on. The reasons for this were first of all, that there was a lot of concern that the number of deaths involving paracetamol overdoses was increasing, particularly in young people. And then we did an interview study with quite a large number of patients who'd taken paracetamol overdoses, which showed that they often took them impulsively, and that the size of the overdose was very much influenced by amounts available in the household. So was this legislation effective? Well, we published our first assessment of this intervention in the BMJ, and you can see from this cover the answer that it did seem to save lives. So in the 3 to 4 years after introduction of the legislation, there was a reduction in the numbers of tablets taken in overdoses, and particularly large overdoses. Admissions to liver units and liver transplants decreased. This is important because paracetamol can have very negative effects when taken in overdose on liver function. And most importantly, deaths from paracetamol overdose decreased in the 3 years after the legislation, equating to 118 fewer deaths. We then did a follow-up study about 10 years after the legislation was introduced. And shown here is the numbers of suicide deaths from paracetamol overdose prior to the legislation. The blue line then shows what would have been projected to have happened. We don't know this definitely should the legislation not have been introduced. And the lower line shows what actually happened. And this slide summarizes the difference in that the numbers of deaths from paracetamol overdose in which there was a suicide or open verdict, and we combine those in suicide statistics in the UK, decreased by 43%, which was equivalent to 765 fewer deaths. And when one included accidental deaths, this amounted to almost 1,000 fewer deaths over this period. So this was a pretty effective intervention. Unfortunately, this message hasn't got through to the USA. This is a picture of a tub of paracetamol tablets that someone acquired quite recently in the USA. Another example concerns the drug coproximol. And this is a combination, or was, I should say, a combination of paracetamol with an extremely toxic opiate drug, dextropropoxyphene. It was a drug commonly used, this combination was commonly used for treatment of pain, such as arthritic pain. And there were very large numbers of prescriptions. In 2003, there were nearly 8 million prescriptions of this particular drug. And a large number of these were for very large, large quantities of tablets. We did a study in the early 2000s where we used mortality statistics and also data from our self-harm registration system. And basically what we showed was the drug had very high toxicity relative to other substances, that 20% of all poisoning suicides in the UK involved this single drug, which amounted to 5% of all suicides. And as a result of this, these findings, the Medicines and Health Products Regulatory Agency reviewed the efficacy and safety profile of this drug. And then in January 2005, our Committee on Safety of Medicines announced that it should be withdrawn in the UK in 2 steps. First of all, no new patients being prescribed coproximol between 2005 and 2007, and then full withdrawal in 2008. And this slide shows what actually happened. The red line shows suicide deaths involving coproximol before the withdrawal began, and then what happened during the 2-stage withdrawal, with the numbers virtually going down to 0. But importantly, suicide deaths involving other analgesics did not increase. So there was no sort of compensation, if you like. So this looked like a pretty effective initiative. And indeed, during the follow-up period, there was a 61% overall decrease in deaths involving this drug, whereas the suicide verdict, which would equated to 500 fewer deaths. And when one combined this with accidents, this was 600 fewer deaths. As I said, no change in deaths from other analgesics. So this very effective intervention led to widespread effects, and we presented our data to the European Medicines Agency, and as a result of this, dextropropoxyphene was withdrawn in all European countries, including Sweden. In America, the FDA, the Drug Regulatory Agency, stopped production, and dextropropoxyphene, the toxic component, was withdrawn in both Canada and New Zealand. So we don't have data from other studies what effects it's had on suicide, but if the UK results were borne out more generally, this could have had very major effects in terms of reducing suicide deaths. And then lastly, in terms of restriction of access to methods, I'd like to mention suicide barriers used to stop people jumping from high structures. And I'm going to give one example. This is of the Clifton Suspension Bridge in Bristol in England, which is over the river Avon. And some work back in the 1990s by colleagues showed that 10% of all suicides in the Avon area, as it's called, which involves 4 counties, were by jumping or falling, which was twice the national rate for this cause of suicide death. And half of these were from this particular bridge. Then after much discussion and debate, in December 1998, barriers were introduced on the bridge, and you can see the barrier on the left-hand side here. It was just erected between the buttresses, the 2 buttresses which suspended the bridge, not on the outside part of the bridge over the banks to the river. And the effect of this was pretty impressive in that suicide jumping from the bridge decreased by half. And importantly, there was no increase in suicides involving jumping elsewhere in the area. And now, internationally, there are a large number of studies showing that similar interventions can be very effective. Lastly, I'm going to refer to pesticides. Now, this may seem a strange thing to turn to. Why is it? Well, has been estimated that something like 1 in 5 of all deaths by suicide in the world involve pesticide ingestion. This is particularly true in lower and middle income countries where there's high levels of agriculture. So, for example, India, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, certain countries in South America, and so on. And one of the issues is that pesticides are often left lying around households, not stored safely, readily accessible for someone to carry out an impulsive self-poisoning act. And because of this, a group of us were involved in a large study in Sri Lanka in which farming households were given these storage devices, lockable storage devices, which they buried in the ground, but with the lids showing, which were locked and could in which they could keep all their pesticide stores. It was a very large study, took almost 10 years from initial planning. It involved over 53,000 households, half of which had the storage box and half of which didn't. The results of this were published in the Lancet, and sadly, this made absolutely no difference to poisoning with pesticides. There was no difference between the households which got the storage boxes and those that didn't, in spite of the fact that there was reasonably good compliance with proper use of the storage boxes over the follow-up period. So this was an intervention which didn't work. But there are other interventions that have worked with regard to pesticide ingestion suicides, and in particular, banning the more toxic pesticides. And this slide shows what's happened in Sri Lanka. The green line here is the national suicide rate per 100,000, the annual suicide rate over time. And you can see in these green columns that where there was the green revolution, the agricultural revolution, and introduction of pesticides, particularly toxic pesticides, the national suicide rate went up. And then beginning in 1984, there was banning of the most toxic pesticides, those recognized by the World Health Organization as the most toxic ones, and further initiatives in this respect during the from 2008. And you can see that the national suicide rate declined as these initiatives occurred. And in fact, the rate of suicide showed an enormous drop from 60 per 100,000 to less than 20 per 100,000. And it's been estimated that this equated to 90,000 fewer suicide deaths between 1995 and 2014. So pesticide ingestion suicides can indeed be prevented through getting rid of the more toxic preparations. I'd like to say a little bit about media reporting and portrayal of suicide. We focus on this because we know that dramatic reporting of suicides in newspapers and other outlets can actually lead to increases of suicide. particularly where these involve celebrities, and there have been several examples of this. This slide shows some newspaper reporting from the UK, thankfully not recent, back in 2008-9, when there was particularly poor reporting of suicides. And this led to introduction of guidance to try and change the way in which suicides were being reported. And does this have an effect? Well, there's quite a bit of evidence that it does. There was a study done in Switzerland quite a few years ago, where researchers collaborated with newspaper editors and produced guidelines for journalists on responsible reporting of suicides. And this was shown to decrease what they call the imitation risk of newspaper reports. In other words, how likely it might be to encourage other people to engage in suicidal behavior. They didn't look at the actual impact on suicide, but there's evidence from other studies, and I've given you one example here, that this can have an effect. This is an early study from Vienna, where there was voluntary restriction on newspaper reporting of suicide on the subway, which had been attracting a lot of attention. And this was shown to decrease the numbers of suicides on the subway, as shown here. So you can see the red columns are suicides leading up to the change in media reporting. And you can see, just looking at the shape of this, that the numbers of suicides decreased markedly afterwards. And also there was some impact on attempted suicide on the subway, as shown in green. So this is an important focus of suicide prevention initiatives, that of the media. In the UK, our Samaritans work closely with the media. They've produced guidelines for better reporting of suicidal behavior. And in addition, they monitor all suicide reports daily in both national and local newspapers and other news outlets. And they give rapid feedback where they think the reporting has not adhered to agreed standards or to the recommendations of their guidelines. And this has resulted in a huge improvement in reporting. We did a study 3 or 4 years ago showing that there had been a very considerable improvement in relation to a number of aspects of how suicides were reported in the news. The Samaritans group also advised program producers, so on TV programs and documentaries on their scripts in relation to how to address suicide in their programs. And lastly, I'd like to say a few words about people bereaved by suicide. We know that every suicide death has an impact on a large number of people, obviously family members, friends, but a number of other people can be affected, work colleagues, and so on. And this raises the question of how one can try and improve care for people after such an experience. We also know that those who've experienced suicide, been bereaved by suicide, themselves have an increased risk of suicide. So this is terribly important. And one way this is happening in the UK, and I suspect another number of other countries, is through, police are often the first officials on the scene following a suspected suicide death. And they have a particular opportunity to provide early support for families. And in the UK, they're doing this firstly by providing this booklet, Help Is at Hand, which is specifically for people bereaved by suicide. We did produce the original version of this in my team, and then it's since been updated with greater input from people who've experienced suicide bereavement themselves. And I think it's a very good resource. There's very good feedback from people about this. Another aspect of this is help through bereavement support organizations. And there is now a lot of funding from the government to improve the availability of bereavement support organizations. So the police give information to affected families and others about these organizations. They signpost them, if you like, so that they can go and seek help. Now, whether this is reducing risk of suicide, I can't say that, but it's certainly having benefits for people bereaved by suicide. So in conclusion, certainly some suicides can be prevented, possibly quite large numbers. Effective suicide prevention strategies, national strategies, must include a wide range of initiatives. And I've just presented some of these in this talk. But evaluation of effectiveness, as I've also shown, is challenging. And very importantly, suicide prevention needs strong political backing. We've got it of late in this country with a specific minister taking an interest in suicide prevention, and also government investing quite a lot of money in improving suicide prevention. And I would conclude by saying that there seems to be evidence that the effectiveness of suicide prevention is growing, not just from the examples I've given you, but also the fact that the global suicide estimates that I presented at the beginning, if I had given this talk a short while ago, I would have given you a larger figure, because the WHO estimate a few years ago was for over 800,000 deaths per year. So it does look as though global efforts on suicide prevention, with the numbers now down to just over 700,000, are having beneficial effects. So thank you very much again for giving me this prize, and thank you for listening to my lecture. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you very much, Professor Horton. What I did was that I mailed to people in psychiatry here in Skåne, and I asked them to send questions to Professor Horton. So I will ask you a few of those questions now. We'll see what you say. Well, we start with the pandemic, because we are well, maybe we are at the end of the pandemic, we'll hope so. But what do you think of the potential impact of the COVID pandemic on suicides?
Well, there was obviously a lot of initial concern about the potential impacts on both suicide and attempted suicide, self-harm, because of the mental health and potential mental health effects, particularly of lockdown and other public health measures. Now, in fact, it looks as though that initial concern hasn't been borne out, at least so far. There was a study done where data were collected from 21 countries on the impact on suicide rates in the first few months following the real development of the pandemic, particularly from March, April last year, when many of us went into lockdown and so on. And there was no evidence of an increase in suicides in any of those countries. In fact, in 12 of them, suicide rates decreased. And we found interestingly a similar effect on self-harm. More recent evidence, which is currently being examined, but as far as I know, again, doesn't indicate that suicide rates decreased in subsequent months. Obviously, we're always a bit behind. We're not always up to date, of course, with suicide statistics, but at the moment it looks as though suicides have not increased. But, and I'm not the only one to emphasize this, it clearly requires ongoing vigilance, particularly as longer term aspects of the pandemic may play out. And one thinks, of course, about the potential impacts on the economy and also on mental health, and particularly the mental health of young people. There's been a lot of concern about that. So it's a good news story as far as the evidence goes so far, but there's obviously uncertainty about what might happen in the future.
Okay, thank you. Another question. Do you think that all suicides are preventable?
No, I would certainly not suggest that they are. One could question, whether one should be trying to prevent all suicides, but undoubtedly large numbers can be prevented. I think particularly those which result from short-term thoughts of suicide. We know that suicide crises are often short, and prevention should therefore be, aimed at trying to help people get through these crises safely and come out at the other side when hopefully their thoughts have diminished. This, potentials here are for making it clear that there are helping agencies available, encouraging people to go and get help, be it informal help from family members or friends or from other agencies. Obviously, we want ready availability of agencies that can help with suicide prevention. And also, and I've touched a lot on access to means. That's again important, particularly trying to reduce access as a way of helping people through an immediate suicidal crisis. So that's a rather long-winded way of saying, no, I don't think all suicides can be prevented, but a lot can.
Okay, and then a last question. Is lithium's anti-suicidal effect specific, or is this effect secondary to prophylaxis of affective disorders?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I mean, we know that lithium is pretty good as a mood stabilizer. So in terms of helping control ups and downs in mood, but it's also suggested that the benefits may come from the impact of lithium on psychological factors which may influence suicide risk, particularly impulsivity and aggression. And it's interesting, when lithium was first introduced and studied, this was back in the 1950s in Australia, it was in relation to reducing aggression in people with criminal tendencies. So I think the answer is we don't know precisely how it's effective. I suspect it is multifactorial, a combination of the impact on relapses of mood disorder and on the psychological characteristics which may increase suicide risk.
Okay. So thank you very much, Keith Horton from Oxford. And there's much more to do concerning research. That's why we have our research centers in Lund and in Oxford and elsewhere. So thank you very much.
Thank you again. Thank you.
So I also finally would like to extend my thank you to Professor Horton for a very exciting lecture. I learned a lot, definitely. Normally we give out the prize of 75,000 crowns here in person, but since that was not possible, I have checked with our treasurer that the prize has been submitted and delivered to Oxford already. Isn't that so, Pelle? Thank you. Thereby we finalize the open part of this day's meeting. Thank you very much. We take a 5-minute recess and continue with the part that is only for members of the society. So, leg stretcher of 5 minutes. Thank you.